I still can't believe you went. What are you thinking? Going to that place?
What?
Wish you hadn't got yourself into this mess, but you did. You can't run forever. I know you were just trying to do right by me, so I need you to do what's right by us. Now, please, Caz. I am so tired of fighting. I just want it to be over.
Still Wasted Deep is a game that came out of nowhere, jump scaring us while becoming one of the best narrative horror games to be released this year. Despite this though, it's a relatively short experience, opening up questions of how long games should be. So, in this video I'll be taking a look at the game itself, giving you my thoughts, and trying to answer the question of how short is too short. So, without further ado, let's make our way to the rig. Still Wasted Deep isn't your average horror game. It's based in one of the most dangerous locations on Earth, that being Scotland. Well, more accurately an oil rig off the coast, making it only slightly less scary than Glasgow on a Friday night. We play as Caz, a man running away from responsibilities on the mainland, hoping the crashing waves will bring solace at the penalty of isolation from his family. What starts out as merely one of the most dangerous professions on the planet quickly devolves into Lovecraftian horror. With the oil rig in turmoil and escape routes slowly being closed off, Caz must manipulate mansplain male panic his way through. This game comes from the Chinese Room, an award-winning studio based in Brighton, UK. Somewhat surprisingly, they've delivered some very well-received titles over the years, such as Dear Esther, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, and are working on Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, which will definitely come out in our lifespan. As long as you're part of the masquerade, that is. Jokes aside though, Still Wasted Deep is an amazing narrative horror game, and it feels like almost everything about it has been expertly crafted by a relatively small team given the quality on display. A great example of this are the characters we meet.
Caz, you won't leave me. It's bloody terrifying out there.
Caz and the crew aboard the Beer-a-Dee rig are not some larger-than-life caricatures or Highlanders fighting for freedom. Instead, each crew member feels incredibly human. From the union representative trying to convince workers to fight for better conditions.
If we don't take industrial action soon, this place...
come on!
If we don't take industrial action soon.
To our friend Roy, being mocked for his football team of choice.
Remember, life is like football. It's not over
until the final whistle. Aye. You're a Barnsley fan, so you're pretty much fucked from the off, right?
Oh, I will see you hand for that, McCleary.
Each of these characters feel alive and fully realised in the story. The fleeting moments of levity, such as one between Caz and Roy as they're joking about Star Trek to escape their dark reality, are not only funny but feel very natural, fitting in well without feeling forced. And many other games with larger teams and budgets have failed to make characters so convincing. Part of this comes from how the characters are communicating. Where other studios might have stopped at the accent, the Chinese Room have really dug into how people up north speak, by using the C word every 5 seconds. Okay, I'm only half kidding, but genuinely the harsh language really does help make these characters feel real. Having grown up in the UK, the dialogue, swears and all feels very authentic. It's not what you're going to find in a film or TV show. It's a far more raw depiction than that, and really helps to immerse you in the world the Chinese Room have built. The other half of this is the slang of the crew, with a lot of Scottish-specific terms being used to confuddle the Americans. Again, really helping to immerse the player in the lived reality of the crew aboard the Beer-a-Dee. If you want to hear a bit more about this though, both Painticus and Eurothug 4000 have done brilliant reviews that cover this a bit more, so I'd highly recommend checking them out if you're interested. I'll link their videos down below. Before moving on, I'd like to talk about one character in particular, our protagonist Caz. First-person characters can be somewhat muted to allow players to fill their shoes unobstructed, but Caz is a firm exception. A family man running from the mistakes he's made, Caz has an outward appearance of confidence that is somewhat undermined by his actions. From his decision to run away from his family, abandoning them at Christmas, to his initial reluctance to help out with anything not escape-oriented, Caz is simultaneously brave and a nervous wreck of a man. Despite it all though, he does everything he can to help save everyone, albeit occasionally requiring a little persuasion whenever asked to do something akin to a suicide mission. And to be honest, fair enough, Caz. But despite his many flaws, watching him grow over the story is brilliant to see. My main critique here isn't to do with how any of the characters are portrayed, but more that I wanted more time with them before everything kicked off. The main opportunity for this is in the canteen towards the beginning of the game, but given one of the characters has an urgent tone in the sequence, telling you to progress the story, I didn't end up interacting with as many people as I would have liked, missing out on what I didn't realise would be one of the few moments where everyone was gathered, and I think we needed a couple more interactions with certain crewmates before everything went awry. While I've already talked about the attention to detail that's gone into making the crew feel believable, a character I've neglected to talk about so far is the oil rig itself. The story takes place in 1975, just a year after the Health and Safety at Work Act came into effect, forcing employers to actually protect their workers. And yet Cadal, the corporation behind the BRD rig, have been rather predictably slow to act. Faulty wiring on deck, obstructed doorways, and rusted bolts holding safety boats are treated as quirks and charms of the BRD rig by the corporation aiming to maximize its profits, ensuring it was a death trap even before Lovecraft crawled out of the depths. The great thing about this though, from a video game perspective that is, not a blatant OSHA violation, is that it adds some amazing atmosphere and world building to Caz's reality. Most of the corner-cut design of the BRD rig is perfectly presented to you, without the need for dialogue to spell it out explicitly, although if you go looking for it, there are Union notes lying around earlier on, further establishing the death trap Cadal has sent its employees into. One thing the Chinese room has absolutely nailed here is the interior of the BRD, specifically the living quarters of the rig. As Caz goes to leave his room, he's greeted by a well-worn tartan carpet, with the heavy doors having left it threadbare in places. The wear and tear in particular adds to a feeling of a lived-in world. It also has undertones of a company refusing to replace its aging infrastructure, a problem Britain remains all too familiar with in the present day. The ceiling in the living quarters reminded me of my own place of work. I work in a lab, and the corridor ceilings always have missing pieces, with construction work of some kind going on, so seeing it here really added to that sense of the rig having constant work done to patch up problems in one area, only to have to deal with them again a few weeks later. The Chinese room have also done a brilliant job at winding the clocks back to 1975, with great attention to detail being shown for the rig, and it's like I've time travelled when exploring the various rooms and corridors. It gives this strange feeling of nostalgia for a time period I never lived through. The interior of the BRD also helps paint a subtle picture around Caz. Our protagonist might have been evading authorities on the mainland, but the room we start the game in, along with the claustrophobic metal corridors connecting to it, make it feel like Caz simply traded one potential prison sentence for another. A small detail I really liked was that Caz's door has been seemingly put on incorrectly, opening outwards unlike the other dorms around him. And this is great. On the surface it shows the shoddy, uneven construction of the oil rig, further adding to that feeling of everything being a light breeze away from collapse. But it's also a great metaphor for the predicament Caz finds himself in. His door has been attached the wrong way, with the lock on the outside, meaning Caz can't secure himself in his room, but other people are free to confine him to his cell. In an effort to run away from the consequences of his actions, Caz has found himself in a prison of his own making, with nowhere to run when things go south. I've talked a lot about the atmosphere of the game, but I haven't really touched on the grotesque massive tentacles in the room. Before I look at it out of the corner of my eye though, if you like what you've heard so far, please leave a like as it really helps my videos get traction, and if you want to see what I do next, maybe even subscribe. But mandatory plea for survival out the way, back to the video. We don't really get much of an explanation for the monster birthing biohazard, but that's okay. This is very much Caz's story, and as an everyman, his journey of survival understandably outweighs his desire to learn everything there is to know about the mind flayer in the basement. Instead, the fear of the unknown is embraced and well utilized, alongside a tragically human element to the monsters hunting you, with many of them retaining traits of who they used to be. This might vary from person to person, but for me, I felt the horror worked best in the moments where we hear the remnants of a person screaming from inside a nightmarish, tumorous mass, their consciousness being animated by the entity that's taken control. This works really well with their grotesque appearances, although I think it's let down slightly for a couple of reasons. Firstly is something I mentioned earlier. Due to our limited interaction with members of the crew before everything falls apart, the reveal that some of them have been turned into coagulated cryptids lacks some of the weight it could have held if we'd had more time to get to know them better. Sometimes it will be clear Caz knew the person the creature had been.
Still in there. Jesus.
But it feels a bit disconnected on our end, as they might as well be a stranger. The other problem is that while there are some brilliant encounters that feel very unique, a few of the creatures end up feeling rather similar, hunting you down in ways that end up feeling a bit repetitive. It didn't always feel like there was enough variety when facing them to make the encounters particularly distinctive from each other, especially in the darker areas of the rig. This was only the case for a couple of the encounters though, so it isn't a major deal, more just a nitpick. Something that was a bit more repetitive though, were some of the gameplay mechanics. Still Waist Deep is a walking simulator, and like most walking simulators, there is less of an emphasis on gameplay in favour of story, something that absolutely works here. But while the game may want to hold up its story, if the gameplay is shaky at the foundations, the whole support system can crumble. Still Waist Deep has perfectly okay gameplay. It's very simplistic, but that's okay. Not every horror game needs to be Resident Evil, but there are some smaller issues that are worth talking about. Firstly is the overabundance of balancing beam sections. Essentially there will be a ledge that Caz must carefully make his way over, and half the time there will be something that jostles the rig and a quick time event to hang on will occur. Now on its own it's completely fine, it works and is pretty well animated. That happens so frequently, it starts feeling very repetitive, and every time I see a steel beam I'm just waiting for the quick time event to occur. There are also some encounters with the monsters, where the main mechanic is to hide and throw items to distract them, which again worked fine, although it became a little repetitive at some points. I also wanted to talk about the movement in the game. When facing the first creature, even if you sneak past, it will see and attempt to chase you. I died multiple times during this section, to the point I was looking up if I was supposed to do something else, only to find that it was just an issue with the character movement. This wasn't a major thing, as most encounters went fine, but Caz could sometimes feel very stiff to control, and running in particular felt slow and unresponsive at points. There were a couple of smaller bugs as well, like when I repeatedly tried to turn off the subtitles, they kept turning themselves back on, which was a bit weird.
Gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss.
But nothing a patch couldn't fix. Overall, the gameplay's fine. There's definitely things that could be improved upon, but given the strength of the story, it's perfectly serviceable, and works for what it's trying to do. If you're not a fan of walking simulators though, this title might not be for you. Video games with a strong focus on narrative will always have a place close to the freezer I call a heart. They can be a truly brilliant medium for exploring impactful stories in a way that you just can't through films or music. And titles like Life is Strange left a lasting impact on me, redefining how I viewed games as a whole. A narrative that often ends up accompanying games with a story focus though, is how long they are, with most ending up having comparatively shorter runtimes than other genres. Now, personally, I don't think it matters how short a game is. It's all about how it uses its length, and I want to make an argument here in favour of shorter narrative games. Firstly, shorter, more contained experiences allow for a quicker turnaround and more games overall. It's coming up to 4 years since the PlayStation 5 released, and yet there are maybe 12 exclusive titles for it? It barely feels like we've gotten started with this console generation, and part of that is it's taking longer to make games. Putting aside the poor work practices and crunch many studios force upon their employees for a second, shorter games, slightly narrower in scope, would allow more titles to be put out with a faster turnaround. Hopefully this would alleviate studios forcing their people to work themselves to death, and we get games more regularly. A win-win situation. A problem a lot of larger developers seem to have is that their new project needs to be bigger than the last, but bigger doesn't always mean better. A game that comes to mind immediately is The Last of Us Part 2. And if everyone puts their pitchforks down for a moment, I'll explain. So, The Last of Us Part 2 is a game famous for being universally loved. with nobody having any issues with it whatsoever. But while people were politely discussing it, I felt that the main issue wasn't about any one aspect of the story, but more the pacing. I won't be getting into spoilers here, but essentially halfway through the game, when you've been playing for maybe 12 hours or so, we get to a real climactic moment before the game rewinds back to the start of the story to follow another character's perspective, and it's terrible. The problem isn't that we're following a new character all of a sudden, as they're actually pretty interesting, and their side of the story is arguably more engaging than the first half of the game. But having all of that progress over 12 hours wiped away so you can do another 12 hours leading up to that exact same point feels exhausting. The Last of Us Part 2 is a game that feels like it could have been maybe 15 to 16 hours, but gets dragged out to 25 hours long. Overall, I think narrative stories benefit from having some time restraints to them, limiting the scope for the writers to something a bit shorter and more concise that doesn't overstay its welcome. Another approach that I think has worked quite well is taking inspiration from other mediums, namely TV, with its episodic format. Games like Life is Strange or Alan Wake do this really well. The episodic format means there are narrative arcs that can take place over smaller gameplay sections, enough to have a good time, but not long enough to overstay their welcome. For Alan Wake, each episode is somewhere between 2 to 4 hours long, allowing for the story to develop and unraveling some of the mystery. When each episode ends, it feels natural. It keeps me hooked about what's going to happen next, like I'm going to have to come back next week to play it. Same bad time, same bad channel. With that being said though, while I really like the episodic format used, given each episode is roughly 3 hours long, and there are 6 episodes for the first Alan Wake, it is significantly longer than something like Still Wakes the Deep, which could fill maybe a third of Alan Wake's runtime, not even including the DLC content. On its own, this isn't really a problem. Sure, Still Wakes the Deep is a bit shorter than other horror games, though it's probably beating Resident Evil 3, but if the story is brilliant, do we really care about the runtime? I would say that in isolation, it shouldn't really matter how long it takes to complete a game. Except in the real world where time is money, people want the best value for their cash in hours. I made a joke about Resident Evil 3 a second ago, but I think that game is a great case study for what we expect from our releases. The Resident Evil 3 remake was quite a short entry, coming in at around 5 or 6 hours. But given the reuse of a lot of assets from Resident Evil 2, combined with the removal of entire levels from the already shorter experience, when Capcom was selling it for $60 initially, a lot of people had, we'll say, opinions on the topic.
It is not worth $60.
Resident Evil 3 has become the black sheep of Capcom's remakes, something that might have been avoided if it had been sold for $20 instead of the $60 they were asking for. They might have needed to tweak Nemesis a bit as well. It's kinda telling they knew it wasn't as good when his name got removed from the title. Still Wakes the Deep is £30 in the UK, and it took me around 6 hours to complete. When we're asking if a game is too short, we're really asking if it's worth the money we're paying. And while I think Still Wakes the Deep is a brilliant game, it's still a bit more pricey than what I would pay normally, especially if I don't know much about the game before buying it. I was able to get it on Game Pass, and putting aside a whole video's worth of criticism I could lob at Microsoft for a second, it did allow me to enjoy a truly brilliant game, without thinking about the smoking hole it left in my wallet. If you haven't subscribed before, Game Pass is £1 for the first 14 days, and that's a brilliant price to experience this game, and kinda makes the game's length feel irrelevant as well. Still Wakes the Deep tells a gripping story, based in a world that feels believable and grounded, and if you're a fan of horror or narrative games in general, whether via Game Pass or a Steam Summer Sale, I'd highly recommend giving this one a try. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I finally made it back to talking about video games. Look at that! If you liked the video or thought it was okay enough to not turn off, then please leave a like to boost it in the algorithm. And if you want to see what I do next, maybe even subscribe. I'm going to try and put out content a bit more frequently from now on, which isn't really saying much given my upload history, but hey, I'm trying. I've got a lot of ideas for future videos, and I've teamed up with an editor to help me get stuff out a bit faster. So a big thanks to Isabel, and I'll have her links down below. I'm considering trying to set up a Patreon at some point, because YouTube pays me next to nothing, but I'm waiting till I suddenly become organised before deciding on anything, and that seems like a problem for future me to deal with. But hey, I've been Banquo, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in a bit.